Massachusetts presidential primary, which looks to be a very exciting event for both parties. I want to express my gratitude to both of you and your committees for being so supportive. When I sat before you a year ago at this time, there was some uncertainty on my part whether we would have the resources to do that because of the underfunding of our accounts. Now, during the summer, there was some erroneous information put out relating to revenues, and it specifically mentioned my department. And it suggested specifically that our non-tax revenue was not meeting benchmarks. That's completely untrue. In fact, right now, we're $22 million ahead of where we were last year to date. That's in large part due to the tremendous number of recordings in the registries of deeds. And I should point out that those numbers that I'm presenting to you are the narrower numbers. It takes out the monies that are reserved for the preservation funds as well as for the monies that go to the Department of Revenue. This is just the fees that my office provides. In the area of fines, which is another area that came into question, at this point we had projected we'd have $4 million in fines for the entire fiscal year. We're well above that right now in the securities area. So we're on track to have a year that brings in revenue far exceeding the projections that we presented to you last year. In the area of elections, while it's better than it was last year, it's not enough, I believe, to provide for the monies that we're going to have to expend. And let me tell you why. First and foremost, some of the fixed costs relating to the state election. As you know, my budget, the department's budget, is very cyclical because, for instance, this fiscal year, the coming fiscal year, will feature two elections, the primary in September and the general election in November. And part of that process, of course, is we provide monies to the cities and towns in the form of so-called extended polling hours. The amount of money for that has gone up since, based on the auditor's findings, has gone up since 2012. So there's going to be more money required. At the present time, it looks like there could be as many as 6 ballot questions, depending upon what the legislature does. That will require the printing of the information of voters booklet. There are other printing costs that are unclear. So I'm suggesting to you that while the governor's appropriation proposal is better than obviously it was at this time last year in terms of the actual needs, nevertheless there are still things that need to be addressed that I can't speak to right now with total confidence, but I don't think that the funding is adequate at the present time. I want to point out one thing in particular that is of great concern, and that is the issue of early voting. Now, that's something I think that you all should be very proud of. Two things, first of all, I should tell you. As many of you know, we've begun our online voter registration, which was part of the same act that provided for early voting. And it's been phenomenally successful. Just yesterday alone, we had over 5,000 people register to vote online. Since we began our campaign at the beginning of the year, we've had over 55,000 people register to vote. So it's very impressive, it's very effective, and I'm very grateful again for your legislative support. With regard to early voting, let me tell you that like anything else that's new and that we haven't done before, you start to discover things about the process that you hadn't thought of. For instance, clearly we are encouraging some of the larger communities, not just larger population-wise, but larger geographic communities, to consider having multiple locations for early voting. If we're going to do that, and we hope they will, and we believe they will, we're going to have some method by which we track the people who take the early ballot, so that, for instance, they can't go to one location and vote and then go to another location. Now, before people get all excited, we don't think that's going to happen. We don't think that most people are going to do that. But we have to protect the integrity of the process by having a process that we can be assured of that. So what we may have to do is come up with some sort of electronic polling book that will allow, if somebody goes to one location, it to be immediately registered that they have voted. That's a cost. While I don't subscribe to the theory that all of early voting is a local mandate, I do not agree with that. But I do think there are certain fixed costs that we're going to have to be supportive of the cities and towns on. We asked the governor, when we proposed our proposal for the budget, to provide a separate line item for early voting. They provided $400,000. I frankly don't think that's going to be enough. I think there's going to have to be more monies expended. We're still in the process. We hope to have the regulations on early voting announced before the end of this calendar month. And we will obviously be open to comment by the clerks and other interested parties, by the parties, by other groups. We want to hear from everybody. Another area that I think is really very important is something that we're now working on, believe it or not, is the census 2020. 4 years from March 1st, which is 4 weeks from now, we will be taking the 2020 census. And that process doesn't start in 2019. It has begun. Right now, we're in the process, actually, of assisting the Commerce Department identify what are known as natural boundaries. This affects, obviously, your communities. It affects your legislative districts in the long run. These natural boundaries will define the census tracts that will be used by the federal government. The Commerce Department asks us to help them identify changes that have occurred within communities, to correct natural boundaries where they occur. After that, the next process will be asking local governments to assist with new housing developments, new streets, new locations, all these things gearing up towards making an accurate count in 2020, which is a very short time from now. So that's something, while there is an appropriation there, and we're grateful for the appropriation. Of course, as I think all of you know, we work with the Donahue Institute on that. Nevertheless, there could be some additional revenues required for that. Lastly, let me mention a bill that's now pending. It's passed the House and pending in the Senate, and that is the Public Records Reform Act. We're very anxious to see this bill pass. We think that there is a need for more transparency in public records, and I've spoken repeatedly about the need for better enforcement. But as I look not just at the bill that passed the House and the bill that's pending in the Senate, but the amendments that are pending in the Senate, it's very obvious that there's going to be additional costs relating to not only enforcement, particularly if the communities are required to respond more promptly, but there are also going to be costs for the communities. There are suggestions in some of the bills, which we embrace, that we need to provide better education to some of the bureaucracies. There may well be some need for additional support for these various communities to provide the public records we want them to provide. I'm not coming to you today with a request on that, but I'm flagging it for you as an area that may well need additional revenue if we're going to do the job that you want us to do.